Welcome to Crack It. As per our subscribers' interest, we are going to start a new series for the Spring Security. So we are going to create a new crash course for Spring Security, and we will create a separate videos for OAuth implementation and JOT implementation as well. So before we start coding for the JOT implementation or OAuth implementation or the Spring Security crash course, we need to understand the architecture of Spring Security. So for that, we have created a video for the Spring Security architecture, and that's here. So in this video, we are going to deep dive on detail about the Spring Security 6 architecture. Let's try to understand the Spring Security architecture. In other words, let's try to understand what will happen to our request when it enters into the Spring Security architecture. So I want you to understand all these steps really well. Why? Because while implementing the Spring Security in OAuth, or while implementing our Spring Security in JOT, or while implementing Spring Security as a user in password stored in the database or LDAP, or whatever the authentication method that we use, we will override few or most of these methods in our implementation of OAuth or JOT. So I request you all to understand this Spring Security architecture really well. Before we deep dive into the further coding of Spring Security, I want you to understand the Spring Security architecture. So, it's really important to understand the Spring Security architecture. Why? Because in the future coding process of securing our application through OAuth, or securing our application using JOT, securing our application through username or the password that is stored in database or LDAP, or whatever the authentication method that we are going to use, we are going to override few or mostly almost all of the concepts in our coding. So I suggest you to understand all these concepts comprehensively so that it will be easier for you while we were doing our actual coding. So first, when a request comes into my Spring Security architecture, what will happen? How will this request first comes? The request may be through UI. Just now, when we were coding for the basic authentication of the Spring Security, we saw that that was through the login page. So the request may be from UI, the request may be from the any front end application, the request may be from the postman, or from wherever the request comes through the client. The request will first go into the Spring Security filters. So what will the Spring Security filters do? There may be a chance that this request may be an open API, or a public API, or the request may be a protected API. So what is public API? What is protected API? So if we want to expose our API without any security, then without any username, password, or without any credentials matching or validation, then those APIs are called as open APIs. There is anyone can access those APIs. So the APIs which we need to protect, which the users need to provide the user credentials, then only they will be able to access the API. Those are called as the protected APIs. So this Spring Security filter is the first step, and this Spring Security filter will analyze whether the request is an open API or a public API, or a protected API, wherein we need to key in the user's credentials. So it will analyze and it will process the request based on this. So also I want to tell one more thing, that Spring Security filters is not a single filter. There are multiple filters. There are close to 20 filters in the Spring Security. Next, what will happen? What is the second process? So what will the Spring Security filter will do? I'm just recapping. So Spring Security filter, it will receives the request from the client. It will process the request. It will identify whether it is an open API or a protected API. If it is an open API, no problem. It will forward the request. If it is a protected API, what will it do? it will convert the request into the authentication object. So what is the authentication object? Security filter, as it's one of its step, will extract the username and the password information from the request, and it will create the authentication object. So my authentication object will have only the username and the password. So what is it? Why do we need this authentication object? It is because my Spring Security framework accepts only the authentication object. So it is a really important step wherein my username and password is extracted from my request, and it is getting converted, or my authentication object is created in the Spring Security architecture. So this is my second step. First step, receiving request and going through the Spring Security filters. As a part of this filter process, it will create the authentication object, and this is my second step. And it is mandatory that we need to use authentication. Why? Because Spring Security Core Framework uses it, so we need to use it. I have my authentication object. My Spring Security filter will now hand over the request to the authentication manager. So what is this authentication manager? Authentication manager is an interface which will actually manage the actual authentication logic. So provider manager, this is a class that is implementing the authentication manager. I have just provided here for an example. This is the commonly used class which is implementing authentication manager. So what will this authentication manager do? It will check what are the available authentication providers in my web application. So I can have, what you need to understand in this point is, I can have multiple authentication providers in my single web application. I can authenticate one of my endpoint using Jot. I can authenticate one of my endpoint using the DAO authentication provider. I can use a WAUth for one of my endpoints. So I can have any number of authentication providers in my single web application. And inside these authentication providers, we will define the actual logic of authentication that we want. So whether I want to validate the user credentials from the database like the DAO authentication provider, or I want to use it from the LDAP, or I want to use it from any of the authorization servers like Auth, or from the cache, or whatever the authentication logic I'm going to use in my application, I will provide all those multiple authentication methods as the multiple authentication providers here. So actual authentication, where is it happening? It is happening in the authentication providers. I have implemented all my authentication logic here. It's no need for me to explicitly write code for each and every authentication provider. I can also leverage the Spring Security provided interfaces and classes to use the authentication, because authentication is like a common wherein we need to compare our username and password that is stored in the database or in the LDAP. So that's like a common framework. So already Spring Security has implemented all the common logic for us, which is required for majority of the projects. So we can reuse or we can leverage the Spring Security code itself for the authentication, or if we don't want to use the Spring Security's code, we can also write our own logic for this authentication providers. So what is this authentication manager will do? This authentication manager will identify for this specific API which authentication provider it needs to use, and it will use that authentication provider. Also, if suppose my API went to the first authentication provider, for example, let's say DAO authentication provider, and if it came back saying that it got failed, it will not return the response as a failed authentication. It will go try the next authentication provider that is available in the list of authentication providers in my web application. So it will try, before sending a failed response, it will try all the available authentication providers in our application, and if everything is failed, then only it will return the failed response. If not, it will try everything, and if it finds a success response, that it will use that specific authentication provider. So while developing coding, I'll explain you each and everything. We will override or we will reuse this Spring's concept. So I'll explain each and everything while coding, while we code as well, but you should understand the architecture well. But before coding, you need to understand what is authentication or what is the authentication manager. So while coding, if I use these terms, you need to correlate the terms with the logic that I provide here. That's why I'm explaining all these clearly now. So my what and all we see till now. So my request will come to the Spring Security filter. Spring Security filter will filter it. It will create an authentication object. Why it is creating an authentication object? Because my Spring Security framework supports only the username and password as the authentication object. My this authentication object will be handed over to the authentication manager by my Spring Security filter, and this authentication manager will have multiple authentication providers. It will forward the request to one of these authentication providers. What will this authentication provider have? Only this authentication provider will have the actual logic for the authentication. So we are clear on all these, like for 1 2 3 4 steps. Let's try to understand further. Next is nothing but the user details service. So if we are going to use Spring Security's default authentication providers, then those authentication providers will use this user details service for the user information. Also, in our authentication object, we have password. Will we store this password as a plain object? No, that is not recommended, and we should not do it as well. So how will we store the password? We will store the password in the encrypted form, or we will hash our password in our database or wherever we store our password. So when we try to fetch and validate the password that is provided by the end user, we will encrypt or hash our password. And so in order to perform all these hashing logic or the encrypting logic, we will use this password encoder interface in the Spring Security framework. So why are we so what is this user detail service? User detail service, if we are leveraging the Spring's authentication provider, then this user detail service will be used. When will this passcode encoder will used? We will not store the plain password in our database. So in order to convert our password, or in order to encrypt our password, or in order to hash our password, we will use this password encoder class. So our authentication object has password, and that is why we are using this password encoder. So after the authentication provider done its processing, the authentication provider will hand it over the response to the authentication manager, and the authentication manager will hand it over the response to the Spring Security filter. So Spring Security filter, before sending the response to the client or the outside world, what will it do? It will store the information of this authentication object in the Spring's security context. So it will store the information like principal, credentials, authorities, whether this authentication is successful or not, what is its session ID. It will store all the information in the security context before handed over the response to the response. So after storing all this information, the Spring Security filter will hand it over the response. So this is the entire architecture of the Spring Security. So first is Spring Security filter for filtering the request, then framing the authentication object, passing that authentication object to the authentication manager, and the authentication manager will hand it over the request to the authentication providers. The authentication providers will have the actual authentication logic, whether it needs to use the user detail service or not, how the password encoding should happen. All these will be done by the authentication providers, which is nothing but the actual authentication logic. Then it will hand it over the response, whether it is failure or success, to the authentication manager. The authentication manager in turn will send its response to the Spring Security filter. Spring Security filter in turn will save that response to the Spring Security context, and then it will send back the response. This is the Spring Security architecture. This you have to understand really well. Why? Because this will be really helpful when we do our coding for the implementation of auth or implementation of the JOT. I want you to understand this really well. Let's try to understand the Spring Security architecture in code. So as we know, the first step is the Spring Security filters. So this is the first filter that the code enters. That is nothing but the authorization filter. So from this authorization filter, the request will go to the do filter method, and from this do filter method, it will go to the default page login generating filter. So if you remember, we got the login page as username and password. So that username and password login screen will come from this default login page generating filter. So after this default page login generating filter, it will go to the username password authentication filter. So this is the place where the authentication object is get created. So if we see here, this attempt authentication method, this is the method that will create our authentication object. So from the request, it will create the username and the password, and it will create the authentication object for us. So what is the authentication object? It is nothing but the user password authentication token. So if you see here, user authentication uh, uh, what is it, user password authentication token in turn extends abstract authentication token, and abstract authentication token in turn implements authentication. Since authentication is the interface, so what are we doing? Since authentication is the interface, this username password authentication filter is returning this authentication object as an instance of username password authentication token. So our Spring Security filter process got over. We have created our authentication object. What is our next step? Next step is going to the handing over the request to the authentication manager. Yes, it will come to the authentication manager's authenticate request. As I told earlier, provider manager is the commonly implemented class of the authentication manager. If you see here, authentication manager is an interface. So provider manager is a class that is implementing authentication manager. So this will come here, and it will come to this authenticate method. So in this authenticate method, if we see, it will fetch all the available authentication providers, and it will iterate it. So it will do the iteration of this authentication providers, as I told earlier. So it will go check all the available authentication providers. Where will the actual authentication will happen? The actual authentication will happen in the authentication provider class. For us, in our example, so I'll show you the code for you. So sorry, where is it? Yeah. In our code, if you see here, we have provided the username and the password in the application.properties, which is nothing but the in-memory user details manager. So for this specific example, it will come to the in-memory user details manager. It will load the username. It will fetch the password using the it will load the username using the user details service, which is provided by the Spring Security Framework, as we told earlier. Then it will use the password encoder, default password encoder. It will validate the user information, and it will hand it over the request to the authentication provider, and the authentication provider in turn will transfers its request to the authentication manager, and the authentication manager will in turn hand it over to the request to the security filters. So we almost saw the classes which are implementing the security architecture. So we correlated what we saw as theory with the code here. So also we will write code on how we can write authorization filter, or how we can handle all those requests while writing the code for JOT implementation or the OAuth implementation. But I hope you're clear with the security architecture. We'll continue this series with OAuth implementation, JOT implementation, and an entire Spring Security crash course. Thanks for watching Crack It. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe for the updates.